Mhm. There's still Antonio's hand raised. Antonio, if you can hear me, why don't you speak?
Should I unmute him?
Hello, everybody.
Antonio.
Yeah, is it necessary to switch on my camera or is not?
Yeah, you can. You are invited to. Would be nicer to see you.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, I have a very specific question, and I'm from Spain, and it's about it because I will consider Spain kind of a loose society, kind of mix as Mrs. Um, Mrs. Michele explained before, but we are kind of used to some special situations. I mean, we are a culture that are used to be in the street, for example. And right now we are in a very bad situation due to Corona.
Yeah.
So in that context, the government is tight in the society. So we have very low rates of criminality and very low rates of demonstration and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is that they want to add another month of quarantine. So my question is that it's gonna have a huge impact in the society because it started to be some demonstration against the government. If it's going to have that huge impact, another month like that, that may increase criminality or may increase some bad aspects that Spain didn't have before, because it was more kind of loose country in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, my heart goes out to you there. I think all of us are really struggling with quarantine. And I think, it's that much harder quarantine in context where we're used to having a lot of liberty and permissiveness. And it's hard for everybody, even in tight cultures, but I think it's particularly hard in looser cultures. And I think from an evolutionary point of view, I think when there's real threat, we do need to tighten. I don't know what the case rate is in Spain right now, but for example, my county here in Maryland is still on lockdown. A lot of the rest of the state is not, but I'm happy that it's under lockdown. I'm getting nervous about in my area, which is near Washington. Once we open up, we're going to be doing this dance, as I mentioned, where we need to be very mindful of abiding by rules. And that means everyone around us doing that. And in loose cultures, it's a little bit harder. We don't have as much experience with that. So we need to kind of think about the idea that this is temporary. This is how I think about it. And that actually tightening helps to reduce the threat. We find that in some of our computational models that you could see it going both ways. When there's threat, you need to tighten, but then when you tighten, that can really help you to flatten curves so that we can gradually be released from quarantine. It's very complicated. Another thing I'll mention that's really bizarre about the United States is that in our world here, it's the tighter states that are having problems. They're trying to basically go out early. They're gathering in larger crowds. And it's a really interesting phenomenon because the leadership in countries really makes a difference. In the US, it's very conflicted. It's very uncoordinated. These tight states tend to also be conservative, and they look to the leadership for messages, for signals. So ironically, in the United States, my sense is that it's the tight states that are following the wrong norm, at least right now, because they're following a government who's conflicted and not taking it as seriously as other governments. So, there's a lot of complexity to this, but I think in addition to tight loose, the government response is really critical to think about how they interact.
There are two questions in the chat that connect with. May I read them to you? Would you expect, given today's situation with COVID-19, that loose countries develop tighter culture? That's the first question. And now comes the second one. Sweden is also a very tight culture. There are many similarities to Germany, but now you can see that during the Corona crisis, they're loosened up. Maybe you have a personal hypothesis for this behavior or this not established rules? Well, that's the question.
Yeah, this is a great question. And for your first question, I do believe that, you can see that the world has been tightening up, at least temporarily, in terms of trying to abide by very strict rules. We also see within that context, an incredible amount of creativity. Many of us who work in university settings are now thrown into very different contexts where we're teaching and we're learning new ways to do that. Many of us are finding new creative ways to connect with family. So I think that we see some simultaneous tightening, but also using the power of looseness for creativity. And I think that's what I think is important in the context of a crisis, veering tight, but maintaining a spirit of looseness. Sweden is a very interesting question. I don't have data on Sweden in terms of its nature of tight loose, but I would suggest that it was an interesting experiment that might have been problematic. In evolutionary theory, I've been studying this now, there's a concept called evolutionary mismatch, when basically what might have been appropriate from an evolutionary point of view has been kind of derailed by forces, whether it's trying out new strategies like Sweden did, that at least now are showing that it's been problematic. We'll see how this evolves. But I think it's an interesting point around evolution is messy. In general, we see a lot of tightening that's functional, but it's not always perfect. And we see this in the animal kingdom as well. But I think it's really important to start thinking about evolutionary mismatches, that under serious threats, we do need to tighten. And maybe we'll learn a lot from Corona. That's my hope, that we'll realize culture matters even more than all of us. I was speaking to the choir here, all the cross-cultural trainers and coaches out there, we know culture matters. But my hope is that, we're going to learn a lot from Corona about how to navigate other threats in the future.
Yeah.
There's a completely different question in the chat, if I may read this.
Wait a minute, Rudi.
Okay, sure.
Wait a minute. You just mentioned the trainers and coaches in between us. And there are, of course, highly interested people who say, how do you apply that in a company or in a team or, on this level where we are working? Could you give examples?
Yeah, I think that, like many of you know, it starts with the vocabulary. Like even just thinking about the world and using the constructs, like we do other cultural constructs, helps us to kind of illuminate things that have been kind of invisible. Mm-hmm. And I give a workshop to chief learning officers on this concept. That was the first kind of aha moment of, oh, wow, now we understand why is some of the groups in our organization more focused on order and predictability, and why are others more loose? Why is it that we have so much conflict? Even in households, we all, as I mentioned, vary on tight loose. I tend to veer more loose as an academic. My husband's a lawyer. He veers tighter. We verified that on our tight loose mindset scores. But we recognize once we see why we've evolved that way, we can manage, our conflicts around tight loose, whether they're about finances, whether they're about parenting, whether they're about how you load the dishwasher. I actually think that's kind of a litmus test of tight loose, because you would be horrified to see how I load the dishwasher. But the point mainly is like the vocabulary really helps you to think about these differences. And I think once we have that, then we can start thinking about how do we negotiate it. I study negotiation and I teach negotiation. And what we know about negotiation is that you need to think about your highest priorities and try to negotiate your priorities. So what domains, if you need to veer tight, can you still loosen up a bit that are not important to you, or vice versa? If you're veer loose, what domains can you tolerate a little more rules in? And of course, the answer to that question will vary by the household, by the organization, but I think it is negotiable. And that, I can't hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. If you can hear me, that's a question that opens a completely different window. Is there any correlation between tightness or looseness with religion? For example, Muslims are tighter? ?
This is a phenomenal question. And if you email me, I can send you a paper that we just published on this. Clearly, tightness is correlated with religiosity. And you can think about why. You know, when you think about tightness is about accountability. It's about being monitored and being accountable to standards. That could be through your communities, through your governments, but it could be through God. So if you feel that, you know, it's just religion is very important to you, you feel more rule abiding in that context. One thing that we have been studying also is people's views of God. People don't all view God in the same way. Some people view God as very loving, and some people view God as more punishing. And in fact, if you look at the Bible, you can see many different contexts and other texts where God is very loving versus very punishing. And what we had the notion about, to connect back to the science paper, is that maybe when people feel threatened, they perceive God to be more punishing. And maybe when there's less threat, people perceive God to be more loving. And that's exactly what we found in this study. And in fact, we found that in times when there's threat, there's more Bible passages being discussed that are about God being punishing. And again, it makes sense in some ways that in context of threat, you want people to behave themselves. You don't want people defecting and doing all sorts of weird things. And so, you know, in that context, it makes sense to have a God that's overseeing and punishing. I know this sounds kind of like crazy stuff, but it's complicated. It's in the sense that, yes, groups veer tighter who are religious, but then we can see some of these interesting nuances. So I think that's how I would respond to that question.
Okay, thank you. There's another one which refers to what's happening in some part of your country, like Michigan and in Germany too. How would Michele explain the demonstrations against restrictions going on in Germany recently?
I can't really speak to the German context. I mean, there's going to be places in all countries that have these kinds of protests. I think, you know, to the extent that there's a one-size-fits-all policy in a country, that could be a problem. But on the other hand, too much looseness could also be a problem when things are not coordinated. It might be that in some contexts, there's no need to have restrictions because there's so few cases. Clearly in the United States, there are some contexts that are really low population density where there's very few cases. So, you know, in that case, we can afford to be looser. So if we are abiding by rules that are not calibrated to the threat, then we might see people getting upset about that. On the other hand, the people that in my country, as I mentioned, who seem to be protesting the most, seem to be following the leader in a very strong sense, in the sense that they are seeing signals that this is not so important. They see national leaders not wearing face masks. They see them not taking the corona too seriously, or at least really being conflicted about it. And so those are strong signals that people follow. And they're problematic. They're part of another, what I mentioned as an evolutionary mismatch. So I would suggest that sometimes people are protesting, you know, probably for realistic concerns that they're being held to strict standards in context that doesn't make sense. But in other contexts, they're being led and they're following very strictly those norms. In a sense, tight cultures are very normative, but they can either be following rules that make sense or actually following rules that don't make sense. And you can see that there's actually two different types of equilibria there. And that's what we're demonstrating in some of our work.
Thank you. There's a hand up from Felix Esteban. Can you hear us, Felix?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question because I am from Mexico and we have a lot of similarities. Well, in my state, because I live in the north of Mexico in Sonora, we have a lot of similarities in the United States. But I think that in Mexico we are more loosened up than many of the countries, because when I arrived here to Germany, I feel a totally different change on the culture, because here they are tied up, and it was like a cultural shock.
Yeah,
That's happened a lot because we are four Mexicans in here, and when we get together, we are so loud. We are so loud. Many Germans that different, weird for them, and a cultural shock. And I don't know, because in my 6 months in here, when I go back to Mexico, I don't know if that's enough to change my loose enough and be more tied up.
Yeah, this is a really wonderful question. Actually, it's interesting you use the term like how loud you are. I think, like the dishwasher test, I think loudness could also be another unobtrusive measure of tightness. I've heard from my colleagues in the Netherlands that, and this is not based on data, but just based on their own experiences, that as trains go from the Netherlands into Germany, that there's a big difference in, you know, the kind of loudness that you see. I don't have data on that, but I do think I'm onto that hypothesis, Esteban, that we could test that looser cultures are louder. You think about even libraries, they're just more quiet, they have tighter rules. But you know, Mexico and other Latin American cultures in our data tended to veer looser. But they have some domains, because they tend to be more collectivistic, that are tighter. So for example, all cultures have tight and loose elements, but my theory would be that the values that are most important in a culture tend to be tight. So in Mexico, that would be like the value of the family, is my hunch. So in general, it's a looser context, and Brazil for sure also in our data. But there are certain domains that evolve to be tight. Strangely, in the US, you know, which tends to veer loose with some exceptions, and has gotten more loose over time. We've analyzed tight loose over the last couple of 100 years in the US, showing increases in looseness. But there's certain domains that are pretty tight, like privacy is very tight in the United States. You don't just show up at people's house. You know, we have this Halloween holiday where you get to go out and ask people for candy, right? And you dress up in these weird costumes. And I always want to, the next day after Halloween, just show up at people's houses and ask for candy. You know, just do that just violate the norm. But people would find that strange because we value privacy so much. You don't just show up at people's houses. In other cultures, you might. And just one other example of this, and I'd really be curious about the domains in Germany that you see as tight and loose. But one other example is in New Zealand that I write about in the book. It's a place that tends to veer loose, but there's some domains that are pretty tight. And one of them has to do with how much you try to stand out, what people call the tall poppy syndrome. And my understanding of New Zealand and Australia as well is that they're very egalitarian cultures. And so standing out violates that very strong value. So when people do that, they get a lot of negative feedback. So it's a tight domain around egalitarianism. So that's just a kind of discussion around, like, we can think about why would some domains veer tight in a culture? When we're training people to understand other cultures, we can give them that macroscopic view of where does the culture tend to veer and why, what's its history, what's its ecology, but then we can zoom in and say, hey, whoa, you know, there's some domains that flip that logic. Japan's another example. It veers tight, but there's some contexts that have like designated looseness, like going out with your boss to drink, or some streets in Tokyo are really just bastions of looseness. It's almost like tightly regulated looseness. It's actually, colleagues of mine have talked about even karaoke is kind of a loose context that's regulated. So I think we can use the lens to not be stereotypical about cultures, to think about, okay, yeah, from a, you know, evolutionary point of view, there's differences, but let's zoom in and let's think about what domains are tight, loose. And so I'll just mention that because maybe you'll invite me back again to talk after we have more research, but we have new scales we're developing that can help to look at profiles of countries and different domains of life. In organizations, we have new measures of like what domains are tight or loose, so that we can kind of get that microscope a little bit more, kind of a more upfront view. Because I think once we have those domain-specific measures, we're in a better position to negotiate.
May I ask you something? When I'm asking for examples for trainers, it comes to my mind what you did with the diaries. And I mean, to come into a looser mindset, for example, about certain stereotypes I have in my mind. I think this is a very good example how creative one could work with.
Yeah.
Memory.
Yeah, I could tell you about the study. I also want to say, I want to mention that I apologize to the group if I was talking too fast. I'm a New Yorker and I talk too fast, and Harry always told me to stop talking so fast. And Paula, his wife, always told me stop talking so fast. And I really apologize. And, you know, Auntie tried to tell me during my talk, you're talking way too fast, you're exhausting us. And I want to apologize. And I want to just apologize to Harry, who, if he were here, he would be telling me you're talking too fast.
I think everybody will be able to follow you, so just keep going.
Okay, so
it was a very good example, which Auntie just mentioned.
So I want to mention that, you know, we know that it's very hard to get people to understand other cultures, and one of the techniques that we developed here at Maryland was called the daily diary technique. And it's a pretty simple idea. We wanted to give people a window into other people's daily lives, because we know that people meet in the media, they have really extreme stereotypes of each other, and they don't really understand what's going on in people's lives. So in our interviews with Pakistanis in Pakistan, they had very extreme stereotypes of the United States, that we were not just loose, but extremely loose, like half naked all the time, and calling the police on our parents because they were too strict. But Americans also had very extreme stereotypes of Pakistanis. They thought they were always in mosques. They didn't imagine them playing sports or reading poetry or listening to music. So what we did was we collected daily diaries in both contexts. And then we randomly assigned people in Pakistan to receive for a week daily diaries of Americans or daily diaries of Pakistanis, and vice versa in the United States. They received for a week, every day, a diary entry from their Pakistani contact or American. And what we found was really remarkable. Over time, people who read about diaries from another culture actually became much more balanced in their perspective on them. They became much more accepting of them. The reduction of cultural distance was much higher when we started reading about real people's lives. These were unedited diaries. So Americans were waking up with their girlfriends more often, but they were also with their families too, that Pakistanis got to see this. And likewise, Pakistanis were in mosques and more strict settings on a daily basis, but they also, Americans got a window into their lives that they never could have imagined. And they even remarked that, yes, we're different, but we see now that we're actually way more similar than we realized. Some people wanted to know the daily diary contact, but we couldn't do that. These were anonymous. But I think this is a method that we can use and scale up, not just about these national differences, but perhaps even political differences and so forth. So thanks for raising that, Andre.
Yeah, and can you imagine to transfer this example into a company's context? Like you were talking about Daimler Chrysler. I mean, these managers, can you imagine how they would exchange diaries?
I think, you know, people love to read other people's diaries. You know, it just feels like you're kind of voyeuristic. And I want to mention that what was really fascinating was that we tried to do this study in a very different context to start. We showed people in Pakistan pictures of Americans, real pictures of them in stricter contexts, like at the dinner table with their parents, wearing more formal attire. We showed Americans pictures of Pakistanis playing sports and dancing at weddings. And we were hoping these kind of primes would also help people to understand each other more, but this technique didn't work at all. People didn't believe that they were actually in these contexts. So we had to say, wait, we got to just really give them real information. And daily diaries are a pretty inexpensive way to get people to meet when you can't fly people from Pakistan to the US. In the German context, one thing I would really like to do, and we're planning some studies on this, is to help people understand refugees and refugees' lives. You can think, I know many of you work with refugees and with immigrants, and these are also prime contexts where there's extreme stereotyping. And I think that we could use daily diaries in these contexts to help natives understand what is happening with immigrants. Often people, we've studied this, don't realize how much they really want to be part of the culture, or don't realize how much immigrants are really following strict rules. Americans tend to have really biased perceptions of immigrants. They actually think they're threatening the society, but actually they're more likely to be trying to be good citizens. And likewise, refugees can understand the host culture through daily diaries as well. So they're another way that we can think about how to get people to not stereotype each other so extremely.
And you know that a lot of our members are also working in this field with the refugees.
Yeah. I would love for you to contact me, and
I
we're
think
doing some research on this topic. Not right now, it's under, it's been paused.
And I know exactly that some of us are busy in that area. Yeah.
And here we should allow Rita to have his say because he's put his hand up. Rita.
Right. Sorry that I'm asking a lot of questions. I'm
Go
taking
for
the
it.
space, these guys. Just one question here. You mentioned the culture in the sense of corporate culture. So my question is, what should an organization with a tight corporate culture, like say German culture, do to operate efficiently in a loose cultural setting, say Indonesia? And what should a training program look like and include in this context?
This is a great question. I mean, I think we all should try to connect across, you know, academics and practice, because I think we could develop some really interesting training programs, starting with the idea of where do you fall in the continuum as a trainer? How have we been socialized in terms of our own tight, loose mindset? I think that, you know, theoretically speaking, it helps to have people understand the trade-offs of order and openness, because the ideal context has both, right? The ideal context has a sense of coordination and order and predictability, but it also has openness and creativity. Even things like innovation, we've been studying innovation, require looseness to create ideas, but they require tightness to scale them up, right? So we need to partner with people who have those strengths. And, you know, I think, you know, that's one way to think about it, is to see where do we kind of fall, but what are we deficient in? What do we need from other people in terms of our liabilities? If you're tight, maybe you need some more looseness to open up and be more creative. If you're loose, maybe you need some tightness to be structured, to scale up. Of course, the devil's in the details, as they say, because often when tight groups want to loosen up, people I interviewed for the book who brought in loose groups, you know, R&D type of groups, had a lot of conflict with them because they came from such different perspectives on points of time, of deadlines. Likewise, when loose cultures kind of scale up, they start getting really irritated by all the rules. So I think that we can use the ideas to help anticipate these kinds of conflicts, negotiate them to the extent that we can, not be so surprised when they happen. And again, leadership is really critical. In the book, I talk about the sort of ambidextrous leader who understands these differences, brings people together. There's not one size fits all. You know, there's ways that different companies can keep loose and tight groups separate, but have them be beneficial for one goal, like innovation. But there's other ways to actually have different tight, loose configurations. So I think the more important thing for me, having been trained by Harry, to think about culture as being, you know, kind of evolved for some reasons, not every cultural difference, but I think training should be trying to get at that concept. Probably you are doing that already, but, you know, we need to understand the culture's ecology and history and why certain differences evolved the way they did. Because that way people can really not just think about specific differences, but the why of culture. So that's, and including organizations, you know, because organizations, I'm going to mention one example. United Airlines veers tight, and airlines in general, because they have a lot of coordination needs, but they kind of were getting really super tight. And my example in the talk was about nations, but they had a bunch of PR fiascos where people were just blindly following the rules, and they needed to kind of become more flexible, what I call that flexible tightness concept. We don't want United to start becoming super loose. Doesn't make sense. They're an airline. You don't want them making all sorts of weird decisions, right? But they needed to find domains to loosen up. That's the job of the leader, to figure that out. On the flip side, think about a place like Tesla or Uber here in the United States. They should be loose, but arguably they were getting too loose. And they couldn't scale up. They couldn't meet deadlines. So they need to figure out how to be more structured in the context of looseness, if that makes sense. And again, one size doesn't fit all, but I think that we can use the concepts to start addressing those questions that you're interested in, Rita.
Right, thank you.